English and Scottish Chaucerians. Broadly speaking, the 15th century is barren in literature, more especially, it is very impoverished in poetry. Immediately after Chaucer, it was the tendency of the 15th century writers to imitate the great poet. The result was that poetry thus produced was merely imitation and showed little of originality and purity. But there were some followers of Chaucer who have contributed to English literature during the century. They may be classified as the English Chaucerians and the Scottish Chaucerians. The English Chaucerians are John Lydgate, Thomas occleve-stephen hawes-john Skelton, and Alexander Barclay. Among these writers, John Lydgate was the most outstanding poet who acknowledged Chaucer as flower of poets. He was very prolific and pedantic. His period was barren in the literary history of England, but he acquired reputation by sheer quality of verse. His chief poems are Troy Book, The Siege of Thebes, and The Fall of Princes. Lydgate's The Fall of Princes is a very vast poem on the lines of Geoffrey Chaucer's Monk's Tale. And it is also a translation 36,000 lines of a French version of Boccaccio's De Caecibus Verum Illustrium. Lydgate was Chaucer's pupil in the sense that he loved Chaucer's rhyme royal. Thomas occleve is the earliest of the Chaucerians who tried his level best to imitate Chaucer. His works are interesting not for their artistic or literary merit but for the light they throw on life of his time. He is a very mediocre writer with no poetic gifts, no sense of humor and no control over his meter. His principal work was The Regiment of Princes, which was composed for the moral instruction of Prince Hall, Philippe le Bel. His most refreshing contribution to English poetry is the addition of the autobiographical touch. Stephen Hawes was the third of English Chaucerian and disciple of John Lydgate. He was drearily scholastic and didactic. His main contribution to English literature is the development of allegorical romances. This is shown in his verses Pastime of Pleasure and Example of Virtue, which influenced Edmund Spenser. John Skelton is known for his satires. His verses are rough and unmusical. His chief works Why Come You Not to Court and Speak Parrot are attacks on Cardinal Wolsey. But his A Garland of Laurel is dedicated to Cardinal Wolsey. Skelton's Philip Sparrow is a beautiful poem on a girl whose pet bird had been killed by a cat. Another fine work of Skelton is Colin Clout is a complaint of a vagabond of the misdeeds of ecclesiastics which influenced Edmund Spenser. Skelton's play Magnificence is an example of morality play. Here, he has satirized the expulsion of some of Henry VIII's associates from the Privy Chamber. Alexander Barclay's important poem The Ship of Fools represents a new type of allegory. The figures in the poem are not the usual wooden creatures representing the common vices and virtues, but they are sharply satirical portraits of various kinds of foolish men. The Scottish Chaucerians. It is strange that Geoffrey Chaucer's greatest disciples were Scottish and not the Englishmen. While occleve and John Lydgate tried to imitate unsuccessfully the spirit of Chaucer, King James I, Robert Henryson, William Dunbar and Gavin Douglas caught much of his spirit in their works. James I's knowledge of Chaucer was acquired during the 20 years of his captivity in England. When he returned to Scotland, he introduced Chaucer to his subjects. His famous work The King's Quair is an allegorical romance for which the Chaucerian stanza was employed. He mixed much allegory with reality. The poem is a description of his love and it imitates Geoffrey Chaucer's The Knight's Tale. The poem gives details of the king's love for a young girl, Joan Beaufort, niece of Henry IV, when he was in prison in England. It is curious fact that Chaucer was held in great repute and respect in Scotland than England because of King James I. The Scottish poets of the 15th century not only employed Chaucer's verse and stanza form but also made use of his themes and shared his spirit. William Dunbar is known for as the rhymer of Scotland. He is considered to be the greatest of all Scottish poets with the exception of Robert Burns. His best works include The Thistle and the Rose, symbolising the union of England and Scotland in the marriage of James IV with Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII. And his other works are The Two Married Women and The Widow and The Seven Deadly Sins. Robert Henryson and Sir David Lindsay are the other lesser Scottish Chaucerians. There is a curious blend of satire, romance, and realism in their poems. Robert Henryson composed Testament of Cresseid, in which the poet laments Cresseid's fate. This poem is modelled on Chaucer's Troilus and Chryseid. The poem deals with Cresseid's wretched condition when she was smitten with leprosy and even Troilus could not recognize her. The poem touched with deep pity and ends on a moral note. Sir David Lindsay produced allegorical poems such as The Dream, Complaint to the King, and The Tragedy of the Cardinal. Gavin Douglas is known for his allegorical poems The Palace of Honour, which is modelled on Chaucer's House of Fame, and King Heart, which is a fine mixture of melancholy and humour. Gavin Douglas also translated Virgil's Aeneid into the Scottish tongue. The Scottish Chaucerians kept the light of Chaucer's verse style burning. Thus, it will not be just to brand the 15th century as a barren one. Please subscribe Literature Guide.